Now it's recording, my bad. It's okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you guys for coming tonight. Appreciate you showing up. We have quite a few people online as well. I wanted to say a couple of words here before I introduce Dr. Jim O'Connor here. And actually, one of them's a breaking news announcement. I just heard at 6 p.m. this evening. But I'll make you wait to hear that. The big announcements that some of you may be aware of if you're reading your Ice Age Floods newsletters is that we've been working on curriculum for young people, 4th through 12th graders in public and private schools across Washington State. And we finished that work and that's published. And now we're moving on to training teachers how to teach about the Ice Age floods all across Washington State. And we're doing that in cooperation with the National Park Service. So the Ice Age Floods National Geologic Trail, of course, they have a big cooperation with us and in their work and with them. So that's kind of exciting. And on top of that, we've set up a scholarship program for both school students and teachers so that we can run field trips for young people in schools that don't have enough money to run field trips to show Ice Age floods features and all that kind of stuff. So I'm excited about that. And that's a big milestone for our institute. We're trying to get young people involved. We're trying to get new people studying the floods at the undergraduate and graduate level. That's the first phase, is getting people excited when they're young. So 4th through 12th grade curriculum in the Ice Age flood. So we're kind of pleased about that. So next announcement before I tell you about the exciting thing is that Joel Gombiner. Have you heard of Joel Gombiner? Some of you are nodding your heads. Well, he agreed to come and speak to us here on March 2nd. So you might want to be putting that in the back of your head. I'll send you announcements like I always do. But Joel Gombiner was the man that just got his PhD a couple of years ago from UW, and he co-authored a paper with Jerome Lesseman, Other Sources of Floodwaters, carving Moses Coulee and other features up in that part of Washington State. So kind of groundbreaking stuff. So that's big news that he's coming. He's going to speak on the nature of waters and ice sheet. So what kind of water you can produce from ice sheets. I heard him give that talk. It was fabulous. If you went to the Floods Fest last July, he was there and gave that. And I was so impressed. I asked him and he said, "Oh, sure, I'll come and talk." So he's coming March 2nd. So now the thing that I promised you I'd tell you that unfortunately, our spring, we call it a membership meeting, but it's the time we get together, have field trips and celebrate. That was canceled because the man who was organizing it, the leader of our Ellensburg chapter that was hosting it, he got some kind of a lung condition and his health deteriorated. So it looks like there'll be no spring membership meeting this year. So if you were looking forward to that like I was, then that's not going to happen, but we sure put our hopes and prayers out for the Ellensburg chapter and people there with the health problems. So anyhow, tonight I asked Dr. Jim O'Connor if he would come and speak to us. And some of you maybe remember going on a field trip with him last May at the membership meeting in the Gorge, or maybe in 2023 if you came to the Rock Out Jubilee at Dry Falls. He came and kindly spoke at one of our meals, kind of at the end, I think it was, before the GSA was having an event there right after us. So maybe you recognize him, but he is an expert. He's one of the foremost experts on floods. He's a geomorphologist. He works at the USGS down in Portland, but he's an expert on all sorts of floods, including the Bonneville flood, which he's going to speak on tonight. And we're very fortunate that he's willing to come up from Portland and take his time to speak to us. And he actually studied from Vic Baker down at the University of Arizona. He got his undergraduate degree here in Seattle at UW. and continued his work. And gosh, I'm just so grateful that you're up here, Jim. So thank you very much for coming.
Well, thanks, Dale, and yeah, thanks to all of you. You probably maybe you've heard me say this before, but it gives us that are working on the floods such great wind behind our sails to know that there's people that are interested in our work, especially in this day and age. So thank you for that. So yeah, and Joel Gombiner is an amazing speaker, and he's got good stories to tell. So I recommend coming and listening to him. His other claim to fame is he and I went to the same high school, not at the same time, but we both went to Garfield High School in Seattle. So this will be sort of wandering and informal. So I think if people have questions, we can take them on the fly. And this is okay if I walk around and everybody hear me. And I guess I have to come back here to advance the slide, but I'll do that. Is there a way to minimize that box?
Yeah, I'm going to minimize it right now.
So we live in the part of the world that, pardon the pun, is inundated by ice age floods, all sorts of floods, floods from ice dam lakes, floods from lava dam lakes, floods from landslide dam lakes, floods from fluvial lakes. And of course, most of us rally around the story of J. Harlan Brett's and Missoula floods, and I'll come to that. But I think what I want to start off with is what I think is the first written record acknowledging ice age floods in the Pacific Northwest. There's oral traditions, of course, too, for these ice age floods. We now are pretty sure that some of the ice age floods were witnessed by indigenous populations that were here at the time. But this account by Grove Carl Gilbert, who at the time was 33 years old, he was part of the Powell survey. John Wesley Powell, famous for exploring the Colorado River. And he was working in southern he's working in Utah, tracing the evidence for this large fluvial lake that formed during the last ice ages. And this was 3 years before the 1879 consolidation of the Western surveys into the U.S. Geological Survey. So he's still working for the Powell survey at this time, and he's approaching the northern edge of the Bonneville Basin, the basin that encloses Great Salt Lake and the Ice Age fluvial Lake Bonneville. And he's looking for an outlet, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later. But he comes up to Red Rock Pass, and he says, "I can see Red Rock and beyond it. It surely looks as though there has been a current through." And then riding closer on his mule or burro, I can't remember what it was, he notes the Red Rock is only one of a number that are here exceptionally bared in testimony to the stream that has washed them in degrading this pass. So this is the outlet of fluvial Lake Bonneville, and the flow going through that outlet was the source of the Bonneville flood. So you can all leave now, you know the story. All right. Okay, so now how do I Okay, so this is worth it. So a little bit of the geography. Last ice age geography 20 to 15,000 years ago. Big ice sheet invading the US from the north. Actually two ice sheets, Laurentide ice sheet over the main part of North America, and then the Cordilleran ice sheet, which formed from coalescing glaciers from the Rocky Mountains and the Coast Range. And that ice sheet sent lobes down into the US, including the Puget Lobe, of course, which your section is named after, and here would have been under about a kilometer of ice at the time. And of course, lobes of that ice, the Purcell Trench lobe blocked the Clark Fork River, forming glacial Lake Missoula. But also during the colder and wetter period of the Ice Age, these closed basins in the interior American West filled with water as well. So many of the closed basins of Western Nevada coalesced into a large lake system called Fluvial Lake Lahontan, and then the basin which holds Great Salt Lake filled, and that became.
I hate to interrupt, but we can't see your screen. So Dale, can you do something?
Sure.
Is that working better?
Partially. Still see a lot of views of the audience and the speaker.
You don't see the presentation slide at all?
Partial of it, half of it.
It says Dale Lehman has started screen sharing. That's all I see.
I see the full slide, but it's just half the screen.
Well, but you should see Dr. O'Connor in the other part.
And you and the audience.
Well, I think probably what we're going to do is just go ahead, but you should be able to see a small version of the slide.
Is that gizmo there, the camera? They're seeing a camera view, they're seeing a view through a camera, not the share.
The black thing there.
Right, they're supposed to see a view through that.
But one of the things looks like it's pointed at us.
Well, it is. It points at everybody.
Oh, okay.
Is it pointing that direction
Oh.
also?
Yeah, whenever you speak, it points at you. So when Jim speaks, it points to him.
Maybe I just.
If you don't mind me interjecting, there's also on the home viewers screens, depending on what kind of Zoom workplace you have, in the upper right corner, there's a button called View. And if you click on that, there's 4 different options. If you click Standard, it will bring the entire slide up. So you can see the slide. So it may also be tied to that because I
No, it
think
doesn't do that.
Okay.
That's okay. I can see a small view of the slide. That's fine.
Yeah, I think we'll just have to stay with that. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Okay, so that's basic geography. The Bonneville flood resulted from the filling and spilling of this lake in western Utah. So what was Gilbert doing up there in 1876, 1877? He was looking for an outlet. The lake had been discovered decades earlier, actually. Clarence King, one of the other early, on one of the other geologic surveys of the West, first described Lake Bonneville in the geologic literature. But Gilbert got interested in this, and he's exploring the basin, and he notes that there's these two strong shorelines ringing the basin. And from this, he deduced that there had to have been two outlets, because it's only if you have a stable outlet will you get a strongly formed shoreline at that level. And so this is what it looks like from the air. And the upper shoreline, again, this is the Wasatch Mountains flanking Salt Lake City. The upper shoreline is now known as the Bonneville shoreline, and the strong shoreline about 300 feet lower is known as the Provo shoreline. And Gilbert's logic was, okay, there has to be an outlet to form those shorelines. And this contrasts to the shorelines of glacial Lake Missoula. Here's Mount Jumbo outside the town of Missoula, and you can see sort of faintly etched but enhanced by snowfall here are the glacial Lake Missoula shorelines. And the difference, of course, is glacial Lake Missoula never had a stable outlet. It was ice dammed, and so as the ice thickness was changing, the lake level would go up and down. It wasn't like there was some sort of rock-based threshold that the lake was flowing over. Gilbert was confused by the two shorelines. How could you have outlets at two different levels? But he knew that there indeed had to have been stable outlets to produce those strong shorelines. Okay, not bad.
Wow. So there's so many views. Oh,
Okay. So again, the overall geography, Puget, Lake Bonneville down here, covering most of western Utah, creeping into southern Idaho, glacial Lake Missoula up here in western Montana, dammed by the Purcell Trench of the ice lobe. Here we are in Seattle under a kilometer of ice. So Gilbert in his monograph that was published in 1890 on Lake Bonneville, which was a masterful piece of work, he detailed all the places that he went while conducting this work, mainly in the late 1870s. And his travel is indicated by the red lines, and the lake is what's shaded in gray here. And you can see how much time he spent in the north end here, going up every valley, trying to figure out if this valley was the outlet to the lake. And those notes that I started off at the top are when he's coming up what's called the Cache Creek Valley up in towards Red Rock Pass, right up here. And this is a blurry blow up, and you probably can't even read. It says Red Rock right there, but this is all the meanderings he did trying to find the outlet situation. So in August 1876, he gets up to Red Rock and he says, I can see the Red Rock and beyond. And Red Rock is this big monolith that sits right in the bottom of the valley. So here is the level of Lake Bonneville at the lower Provo stage. That's 300 feet lower than the maximum Bonneville stage. Here's the shoreline that he's following, the Bonneville shoreline up here, and he can follow these shorelines right up to the pass, but then they disappear. And he notes that the bottom of the pass is at the level of the Provo Lake level. So this basically, he puts it together here, why there's two lake levels, that there was a higher blockage up here, and then that was eroded through until it hit the stable lower level. And that's how you got the two well-developed shorelines. So he says, he gets up there, I can see Red Rock and beyond it. It surely looks like there's been a current through, but it also looks as though the beach line at points nearby was higher than the pass. So that's the Bonneville beach line is higher than the pass. And here's a view looking south towards the Bonneville Basin in the south. This is his burrow here, which he named Ways and Means. Here is Red Rock right here. And here is the valley that was cut by the overflow. And he's standing on this bench, which we now know as the Marsh Creek Fan. And here's a view from the air that I took several years ago of basically the same scene. So Gilbert was in that, he made that drawing from somewhere in here on this bench up above the valley here. Again, this is south in looking south into the Bonneville Basin. And here's Gilbert's again, here's Gilbert's map of the scene. This is the fan that he was standing on here. And this is what's called the Marsh Creek Fan. And basically the story is that this is an alluvial fan that was built out by Marsh Creek coming out of the mountains to the east, built up this fan right at the divide between the Snake River drainage to the north and the Bonneville Basin to the south. When this water in Puget Lake Bonneville was creeping up during the last ice age because input was exceeding evaporation, it overtopped this fan right in here somewhere. And this fan was not hard rock. It was unconsolidated sand and gravel and sediment. And when it overtopped this, at some point after overtopping, it started cutting through it, and it became a runaway process. Once you have a little flow going through there, that erodes more material, and then you have a bigger flow. It just becomes a runaway process. One thing that's kind of interesting, though, is we do know that the Bonneville shoreline took some time to develop. It's a strongly etched shoreline. So the lake had to be stable up at this higher Bonneville level for some time. And we can see evidence of groundwater having moved through the fan in these, what I think are heads of sapping channel networks here. So there is evidence of groundwater flow driven by the lake upstream here coming through that fan. But at some point, the incision of the fan started and it became a runaway process. And Gilbert describes this beautifully in his monograph. I'll just read this here. The fact that the Bonneville water discharge at first over a barrier of alluvium instead of solid rock had much to do with the subsequent history of the lake. Uncemented alluvium is easily and rapidly torn up and removed. And as soon as the current began to flow across the divide, it must have commenced the excavation of a channel. As the channel increased, the volume of the escaping water became greater, and this increase of volume reacted on the power of erosion. In a short time, a mighty river was formed, and the lowering of the lake surface resulted. For a time, the outpouring was a veritable debacle. I always like that line. And it could not have assumed the phase of an ordinary river commensurate with the inflow of the lake until the alluvial barrier was completely demolished and the resistance of the limestone reef below was called into play. So the downcutting channel hit this harder rock, and that ceased the erosion. And the total drop was about 115 meters, more than 300 feet. So Gilbert basically described this flood in his monograph that was published in 1890. But then the flood was lost, essentially. People, I'm not sure what the story is. It's kind of a mystery. But it really wasn't until several decades later that scientists became aware that indeed there had been a flood that had come down the Snake River. And it's especially puzzling that Israel Cook Russell, who did a lot of work in Washington as well, Russell was Gilbert's field assistant for the Bonneville Basin work, early USGS geologist as well. But several years later, in the late 1800s, he was working in the Snake River Plain, and he writes a monograph on it. And he actually takes pictures. These are I.C. Russell pictures of boulder bars in the Snake River Plain, but he does not connect them to the overflow of Lake Bonneville. And I've never understood why he didn't make that connection. He must have known that there was a boatload of water that came draining into the Snake River Plain, a veritable debacle. And he doesn't put these boulders into the story. Another geologist, a few decades later, Harold Stearns, also worked in the Snake River Plain, also took pictures of flood deposits and published them. He too did not put together the story, connect the dots basically from Gilbert's work in the late 1800s to the features downstream. Harold Stearns he recognized these as some sort of large high energy fluvial event, but he inferred that it was a consequence of a lava dam lake failure. So neither Russell or Stearns picked up on it. And in fact, the absence of a flood on the Snake River Plain came into the Missoula flood story during the heyday of the controversies in the 1920s and 1930s. And in fact, Richard Foster Flint, who is one of Brett's chief nemesis in his outrageous flood story, suggested that because you have similar features in the Snake River Plain that were not caused by flooding, that the scabland of the channel scabland could have been explained by other mechanisms, such as leisurely streams with normal discharge, grading and degrading. And here's what Flint said. Flint was known as the Pope of the Pleistocene. And he was a very powerful, influential geologist. He was on the faculty at Yale University and had a long and rich teaching history there. In fact, he was Steve Porter's advisor. I don't know if any of you know of Steve Porter. He was a quaternary geologist at UW for a long time. Steve Porter was actually, he was on the faculty when I was an undergraduate there, and got me intrigued by the Missoula floods when I was undergrad. Steve Porter was one of Richard Foster Flint's students. Okay, back to Shoshone Falls. So Shoshone Falls in eastern Idaho, along the Snake River Plain. This is what Flint has to say. A broad shelf on the south wall, about 100 feet below the rim, consists of scabland with small anastomosing channels, isolated buttes, and shallow rock basins. The thin, vertically jointed flows yielded to the hydraulic force of the Snake River, as similar flows in the Columbia Plateau yielded to the hydraulic force of proglacial streams. Yet I am not aware that unusual floods have been held to affect the upper Snake River. And here's a Bruce Bjornstad photo of that landscape up near Shoshone Falls, Interstate 80 here for scale. It's classic scabland. Brett's actually went there in his work, and he's kind of puzzled by the situation there too. He also didn't appreciate Gilbert's recognition of the veritable debacle affecting the Snake River Plain. He says it's a magnificent example of the Dalles type of channel, which is what one version of scabland, seems to demand a volume of water much greater than the Snake could ever supply. So this is Brett's field notes from July something, I think 1926, but not 100% sure because Mo is covering up the page. So, but he, yeah, 1926. But he doesn't see other evidence of flooding, so he's a little puzzled by the situation out there. Okay, now it's not advancing again. I guess if I don't move fast enough, it freezes up. Maybe I'll quicken the pace. All right. All right. It really wasn't until the late 1950s when a couple geologists working in the Snake River Plain, Harold Powers and Harold Maldy, who went by Hal Maldy, linked up the overflow of Pluvial Lake Bonneville to the flood features on the Snake River Plain. And Maldy wrote a professional paper that was published in 1968 that fully describes the features on the Snake River Plain, the colossal features of erosion and deposition produced by the sudden overflow of Lake Bonneville. He had a different scenario for the overflow than Gilbert did, at least at the time. But Gilbert's beautiful description of what happened at the outlet is now what most scientists agree on, and how Maldy came to that scenario in the end as well. But Maldy did a beautiful job of describing the erosional depositional features on the Snake River Plain, basically between Pocatello and the Swan Falls area south of Boise. And it was this professional paper that inspired my later work for my PhD thesis to look at these features and try to understand them quantitatively on the basis of, sort of taking off from all these qualitative description. And one sort of humorous sidelight, Maldi worked for the USGS, and we have a lot of this, there's some bureaucracy involved with the survey, especially in naming formations and rock units and things like that. Maldi wanted to give the deposits of the Bonneville flood a formation name, and he did, the melon gravel, call it the melon gravel. And he states, in 1955, amused by a whimsical billboard that advertised one patch of boulders as petrified watermelons, we applied them the descriptive geologic name melon gravel. Well, this is the sign right here. Here's me, probably can't recognize me, nearly 40 years ago now, with a melon, which I was later to deliver to my mother-in-law. But here's how Maldi at the same time. And a really cool thing was he heard that I was gonna work on this project, and now the blue, he got in touch with me. He was still working for the USGS, and he said, I really want you to do this. This is sort of basically going over ground that he had beautifully covered 30 years previously. And he read my proposal and says, this sounds great. I'm gonna come up and I'm gonna take you around in the field for a couple of weeks. And so in the summer of '87, that's what we did. And it was just a great it's sort of it's one of the best things about science is when we kind of all on the same team and not competing with each other. And that stuck with me. So Maldi's paper came out in 1968, and then after that, a lot of other folks started recognizing Bonneville flood features along the Snake River Plain, including Harold Stearns, who had missed them the first time. And my work, which was my thesis that was done in 1990, was published in 1993, a few years after that. And people are still working on the Bonneville flood to a certain extent, but not as much as I think they should be. So back to a little bit more context. So Bonneville flood, this is basically the tail of Pluvial Lake Bonneville as it was coming up during the last ice age. It hit that low spot between the Snake River Basin and the Bonneville Basin at Marsh Creek Fan around 18 or 20,000 years ago. And at some point it started eroding, dropped down very quickly down to the Provo level, about 300, about 100 meters lower. And then as climate dried later, it overflowed at the Provo level for several hundred years, maybe a couple thousand years. So for a while, the Bonneville Basin was a tributary to the Snake River and to the Columbia River as well. And that has pretty significant ecologic implications. And then as things got warmer and drier, that basin became closed again down below that, and it's shrunk down to its dismally low level that Great Salt Lake is at now. So that overflow, as Gilbert described it, a veritable debacle. We've played around with colleagues who have developed these fancy mathematical models for modeling erosion, and here's a couple models. Again, time is going the other way now from left to right, but these are models that are attempting to parameterize the flow and the erosion in a coupled way, and putting that together to predict the discharge, the flux of water through that outlet. And so you can see in these models the flow accelerates pretty quickly, and then it comes down. But the scale here is days. You know, tens of days, and the peak discharge at maximum was about 1 million cubic meters per second, about 35 million cubic feet per second. Now let's compare that to the Missoula flood. The peak discharge, this isn't discharge, it's the stage of Spokane, but the peak discharge at Spokane during the largest of the dam break floods was probably on the order of 15 million cubic meters per second, 15 times as much. Although the Bonneville flood involved twice as much water as the Missoula flood. So depending on, you know, what you're measuring, whether it's the peak flow rate or the total volume of water, you know, if it's total volume, the Missoula flood or the Bonneville flood was twice as large as the biggest Missoula flood. And that's the number that's important to me. But the Missoula flood, this scale down here is hours. These are days down here. So the Missoula flood was quick and dirty compared to the Bonneville flood, which lasted weeks and months. And it makes a difference in what the deposits look like. So Bonneville flood, it exits out of the Red Rock Pass over the course of weeks to months at peak discharge of about 1 million cubic meters per second. It flows down Marsh Creek through where Pocatello is now onto Snake River Plain, and then flows west along the Snake River Plain, then turns north. The Snake River goes through Hell's Canyon, and then at Lewiston, where the Clearwater River comes in, the Snake River and the Bonneville flood headed west towards Pacific. And you can trace Bonneville flood deposits pretty much to the limit of this map here. Down in this area here, the Bonneville flood deposits are buried, they're overlain by Missoula flood deposits. And you get further down here where the Missoula floods were highly energetic, they either wiped out the Bonneville flood deposits, or you can't really tell them apart. But you can distinguish Bonneville flood deposits all the way down basically to Lower Granite Dam on the Snake River. And like a lot of these Ice Age floods, the water surface profile was pretty uneven, and it reflected the topography of the river system. So here's the outlet here, and it flows into Pocatello. Then there's this really steep stretch in the vicinity of Twin Falls and Shoshone Falls. And then in the western Snake River Plain, it's not so steep, except for there's this constriction at Swan Falls just south of Boise, which was pretty important. Then it steepens up as you go through Hell's Canyon. And the features at Maldi, the erosional depositional features at Maldi describe relate pretty hand in hand to the steepness of the water surface profile. But I'll show this diagram a few times. Let me show some pictures of some of the deposits. So this is Shoshone Falls right here, and this is the steep reach with these beautiful cataracts, just like this looks just like the channel of Scavlon, doesn't it? Yeah, it's pretty much the same. Interstate 80 for scale flows from right to left, a broad swath of flow on the upland here, and then it's pouring back into the canyon here. Probably did some deepening of the canyon in a few places. Beautiful eroded basalt surfaces. Of course, this canyon was made famous by Evel Knievel and his one of his failed jumps right at Twin Falls. Then as you go further south, so that's that steep reach here. Twin Falls is right there, and then it's the flood is confined through here, then opened up in this area, and this is the area around Hagerman. It is an area where Maldi spent a lot of time too, and he took me there in 1987, and we looked at some of the features. These are some of Maldi's photos. This is a huge boulder bar. This is the view upstream, flanking the Snake River here. Here's another one of Maldi's photographs of a Bonneville flood bar. And if you compare these to a Missoula flood bar, I think you can see a difference. Missoula flood bars aren't as strongly armored as the Bonneville flood bars are. The Bonneville flood bars are densely packed, densely studded with boulders. The Missoula flood bars, of course, have big boulders on them, but they're generally not as tightly packed together. And I think this armoring is because this flood lasted much longer, and most of the smaller stuff was winnowed out. And also, the Missoula floods are famous for the giant current dunes, right? Not a single giant current dune associated with the Bonneville flood. I think it's because here too, the Bonneville flood was much steadier, and you didn't have the flow coming up and coming down quickly, which is what you need to preserve those giant current dunes. More Maldi photos of lower energy sediment deposits, similar ones that I took, and those were down here, just upstream of the Swan Falls constriction. Then flows really accelerated through that Swan Falls constriction. Here's Swan Falls Dam right here. This is a view upstream. The constriction is right around the corner here. This is a huge point bar right there. And these boulders are big. This right here, this person is the daughter of the recipient of the petrified watermelon. Anyway, big boulders. Here's another colleague standing on one of them here. This is in the Swan Falls Birds of Prey area. That's not the right name for it, but it's a very, if you're ever driving through the Snake River Plain and you want to take a half day or a day detour to this Birds of Prey area, you can drive right down there and you can climb on these boulders too. It's a cool spot. Some slackwater deposits, just like Missoula floods. Some places are even rhythmically bedded. And this is downstream in sort of the in the far western Snake River Plain, where the gradient flattened out right before the Snake River drops into Hell's Canyon. And here's a pre-dam photo of Hell's Canyon. by Tracy Vallier in 1965. It's a pretty steep place, but every wide spot has a Bonneville flood bar in it. There's one right here. Here's another view of Hell's Canyon upstream of Pittsburgh Landing. This is a giant point bar right here with a full-size ponderosa pine for scale here. And you can see it's flood swept all the way up to here. So even though we're quite a ways downstream, it was so constricted here, the flood stages were higher here than they were anywhere else on the flood route. And then down in the Lewiston Basin, this is a famous Tammany Bar locality. Here are coarse grain Bonneville flood deposits from flow coming north into the Lewiston, Clarkston area. Lots of Hell's Canyon lithologies in these gravels. And then it's overlain by about 20 Missoula flood rhythmites from floods that were back flooding up the Snake River from ice dam glacial lake Missoula floods. And we see Missoula flood deposits on top of Bonneville flood deposits. And we know that the Bonneville flood occurred roughly, well, pretty precisely around 18,000 years ago, plus or minus a few hundred years. We know that the first Missoula flood was about 18,000 years ago, too. We haven't yet found Missoula flood deposits underneath Bonneville flood deposits anywhere. So, we know Missoula floods came after the Bonneville flood. We don't know if any of the 100 or so Missoula floods preceded the Bonneville flood yet. We haven't seen any evidence of that.
Question,
Yeah.
what is the thickness of those two?
Oh, yeah, I don't really have any scale there. I should have asked someone to climb up here and stand right there. Yeah, so this is probably 50 feet maybe, and this is maybe 200 feet.
Okay,
Something like that.
thank you.
So, the Bonneville flood, has been kind of the poor, sort of the Cinderella of the flood story. It hasn't attracted the attention that the Missoula floods have. Missoula floods have continued to attract researchers for the last several decades. Especially researchers who are interested in hydrodynamic modeling, sediment transport modeling, effects of floods on ocean circulation. But I think the community is missing a great opportunity. The Bonneville flood, more water, a much simpler flood situation hydrodynamically. It was one flood, one route, not like the Missoula floods, 100 different floods, 25 different routes. We don't really know, where water was coming and going and for most individual flood situations. The Bonneville flood is crying out for more work. And I think, my modeling attempt was 40 years ago, and the models are so much better now. That work needs to be redone. And we really, I think, could produce the movie of the Bonneville flood with the technology that's out there now. And more than just as a visualization, component to the work, using the Bonneville flood, I think we could really learn more about the dynamics of bedrock erosion and sediment deposition, because it was just one flood. It was much steadier flow. And some of these questions, such as how do alcoves and cataracts and scabbon topography form, could be worked on. I think more progress could be made with the much simpler Bonneville flood situation, as well as questions of sediment transport and deposition and what the deposits look like. So I think the hydrodynamic modeling is I've been trying to encourage folks to work on that, but I've mostly failed at this point. There are some other specific questions related to the Bonneville flood that I think deserve more work as well. This narrow canyon that Evel tried to jump over, I think it's possible that canyon was cut during the flood. But that's still an open question. I think it's plausible. So the Snake River flows through that narrow, steep canyon right here in Twin Falls. I think it's plausible that the Snake River channel was to the north prior to the flood. We know that's the situation up here in American Falls, Massacre Rocks area, where the Snake River channel came out of a Pleistocene version of the American Falls Lake to the north and came into the present canyon down near the Raft River confluence. And during the flood, the present channel where Massacre Rocks was carved. And I think there are some of these questions are of interest. And as I mentioned before, we think that most of the Missoula floods postdated Bonneville flood, but we haven't really looked very hard yet for evidence of pre-Bonneville flood Missoula floods, and that would be important information for understanding the timing. So I'll just finish up with this final slide. That's basically the Bonneville flood versus Missoula flood. Bonneville flood involved, like I said, twice as much water as the largest Missoula flood, but a tenth to a 20th of the peak discharge of the largest Missoula flood. So more water, but released through Red Rock Pass at a slower rate, even though it was a veritable debacle, than the collapse of a 2-kilometer thick ice dam, which held back Glacial Lake Missoula. So months duration versus days. Bonneville flood, just one flood that we know about. No one's found evidence for multiple overflows. We now think there's probably on the order of 100 Missoula floods. I think most important is that both floods produce great hops growing soil. In fact, I would argue that the northwestern U.S. microsphere industry was founded on Ice Age flood sediments. Thank you.
I have a question. How do these floods rank globally with other large floods? And I'm thinking of the Grand Canyon.
Yeah, so the question is, how do these floods rank globally? The largest Missoula flood, as far as we know, was probably one of the largest of the freshwater floods that we know about. We know that there was a couple of huge floods during the ice ages and previously involving marine bodies of water filling basins. Like the Mediterranean Sea 5 million years ago was basically a desert, and the Atlantic all of a sudden poured into it. That was a huge flood. there's been bigger floods on other planets, especially Mars, but in terms of freshwater floods on Earth, the Missoula floods, in terms of the peak discharge, are probably largest. There've been larger ones in terms of volume, but
You said that you thought that there was only one Lake Bonneville but there were numerous ice ages. And so if Bonneville was a alluvial lake, wouldn't there have been a lot of rainfall with those other ice ages?
yeah, that's an excellent question. And let's see. I might be able to so why was the last ice age special in terms of Puget Lake Bonneville, in terms of water getting up so that high? And the thinking is that one of the main sources to Great Salt Lake and Puget Lake Bonneville is the Bear River that comes in it comes in from the west here. And the Bear River was diverted from draining into the Portneuf River about 50 or 60,000 years ago. Before this lava flow occurred that blocked it, the Bear River used to flow directly into the Portneuf River down here. But then after that lava flow blocked it, it spilled into Great Salt Lake. So the last ice age was unique in terms of how it was amped up by this new water source, basically, of the diverted Bear River.
Is there any evidence of rebound of the Earth's surface where glacial Lake Bonneville once stood?
Yeah, is there evidence of isostatic rebound from the removal of water? Yes, there is. And Gilbert documented that in that same 1890 monograph. And that was probably the most famous outcome of that work, was documenting that isostatic rebound, because he could make some back of the envelope estimates of sort of crustal rigidity and composition from that, and that's been a continuing source of analysis. So yeah, it's got beautiful. I mean, he basically he spent a lot of time surveying in the elevation of the two shorelines and see, and there's hundreds of feet of displacement. The shorelines where the water was really, where the water was really deep and there was islands, sticking out, those have rebounded way back up after the water came out compared to the shorelines around the perimeter of the lake. Yeah.
The Snake River Plain is a lot wider than what the flooding maps are indicating. Are there thoughts on others? Were there other great floods from other directions, or was that just a slow forming natural plain that was not a result of some kind of flooding?
Yeah, the Snake River Plain is mainly a plain built up of lava flows. It's not a valley that was carved by water. So So it's not like your typical valley feature. It's mostly a dry, desolate. Like after spending a couple summers, it's pretty miserable. Hopefully, no one's here from the Snake River Plain. But yeah, different. It has a different sort of geologic origin.
Getting back to the boulders themselves for a minute, I'm assuming they're basalt, is that right?
Mostly, yeah.
So how are they being dislodged? I'm assuming you don't have the flow, like the Missoula floods had the flow to pluck them out, actually. I'm assuming, do we have enough flow to do that? Or are they simply being eroded? Or is there some other, this hydraulic pressure in the cliff face as the water level drops? What's the mechanism for pulling them all loose?
I think the mechanisms are pretty similar. The flood was,
The plucking?
yeah, plucking, yeah, it's a similar geology. Basalt columns are being toppled and entrained, and in some places there's these rock basins like you see for the Missoula floods where there just had to be some sort of great flow sucking to pull stuff out. That's not a highly technical term, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's why I think the Bonneville flood is a golden opportunity for understanding some of these flood processes, because it's pretty clear that very similar. The morphological outcome is very similar. The processes had to be very similar, and it's a scenario. The Bonneville floods scenario where you could probably understand the fluid dynamics a bit better than you could from Missoula floods. But yeah, pretty identical looking features.
Could you tell us more about the Bear River thing you just mentioned? I remember long ago reading something that maybe you think one of the contributing factors to the Bonneville flood was its level rising because the Bear River got diverted into. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm gonna get in trouble if I try to talk too much about the Bear River. I've never seen it myself. But my understanding is that the Bear River is the principal influence water source to Great Salt Lake. And the Bear River diversion did not contribute directly to the Bonneville flood, but it created a situation where Lake Bonneville could rise much higher than it would have during previous ice ages, because that diversion of, prior to the last ice age, 50 or 60,000 years ago, has put a whole lot more water into the Bonneville Basin than had occurred during previous ice ages. And that's why the water rose up to a higher level than it had previously. Is that making sense?
I think so. I guess I'm not sure I understand. What happened that Lake Bonneville got to the place that it washed out what's the name of that group?
Red Rock Pass at Marsh Creek.
Yeah, Marsh Creek. Yeah. What happened with that? Because that had been there for a while.
Is that what?
The alluvial fan of Marsh Creek had been there for a while.
Yeah.
Holding back along the way home.
Yeah.
So what happened? That it's suddenly broke through.
Well, so Marsh Creek had never experienced the rising Lake Bonneville prior to the last ice age, because the lake never got up high enough to lap up against it. So once this, during the last ice age at 18,000 years ago, when the lake got up that high for the first time, it hits this Marsh Creek fan, which is unconsolidated sediment, and and starts eroding through it. So what was unique about the last ice age was that the lake got higher than it had and before any other, higher than any other previous ice age. And it got higher because during the last ice age, but not previous ice ages, it was also being fed by the Bear River, which previously had gone straight to the Snake River. Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, 50 years, but it was the combination. You had to have the colder and wetter climate too to create the lake rising. So it's basically it was the combination of the ice age plus the greater influence. You couldn't, just one wouldn't be enough to get the lake up to that high level. I'm doing a terrible job of explaining that, but yeah, sorry.
So
I need to go there. Yeah. I need to go there. I know that.
So in essence, all the water in Pluto Lake Bonneville was rainwater. There was no glaciers in the mountains of that.
There were glaciers in the mountains, so there was glacier runoff.
Some glaciers.
Yeah, yeah. So the source was, it was there were glaciers in the Wasatches and in the Uintas, and so there was glacier water, glacier melt feeding into the lake. But there were glaciers all throughout the West during the last ice age. But it was the lakes coming up was basically the checking account being supplied with more paychecks and less expenses for a few millennia. The problem we all have all the time, right?
So the basin had no drain in the past. So it was just evaporation, was only losing water to evaporation and previously. And then when you had the combination of the Bear River diverted plus the wet climate, then the basin overfilled.
Right.
Is that it?
Right.
Okay.
So you can imagine if for some reason, if the Snake River got diverted into the Bonneville Basin, Great Salt Lake would go up. Whether it would go up high enough to overtop, I don't know. But during the next ice age, when you have a lot more water coming in, so these basins filling and spilling is a main way that rivers integrate in the way that rivers enlarge during in the West, especially in the basin and range country. And some basins never did spill, like the Pluvial Lake Lahontan, which was here, never got enough water to spill, way that connected it to the ocean. But there's other basins in central and eastern Oregon that did fill and spill into the Snake for a while, like the basin to the east of the Skeens, and here spilled into the Owyhee system. So yeah, it's kind of a fun to explore around out in this country and look at these basins and see the evidence of old lakes and try to figure out whether they did spill or didn't.
Another question. How low did Lake Bonneville drop down before it started getting appreciably salty?
Oh. Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that. It would have been the freshwater system as long as it's spilling in, so when it overtops, it's freshwater, it drops down to the Provo level, it's still spilling for a couple thousand years, so it's a freshwater lake system. But then as it drops down, because you're checking account balance, you're spending more than your paychecks.
Right.
It's gonna get saltier and saltier, but I couldn't tell you at what point it's salty.
So when it got down to the Provo, it would begin getting salty.
As soon as it dropped below the Provo level, because when you don't have a surface outlet, all the water that's leaving the lake is evaporating,
Right.
and that is leaving the salts that were coming into the lake with the water to concentrate.
Yeah. Okay,
That's the way I understand how that works, but
yeah, well, that makes sense.
All right, well,
Thank you.
Dr. O'Connor, thank you for that.
Yeah.